Thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed lunch and we're not feeling too much of the post-lunch slump. Thank you again to HSBC for hosting. Our next panel is Trans Inclusion at Work, What You Need to Know. So this panel will feature trans voices sharing their own experiences of inclusion and how they found and created it, as well as what the broader community can do to be better allies. Moderating is Rich Miles from the Diversity Standards. As panelists, we have Ella Myers-Hall from the Royal College of Art, Natalie Washington from Mars Digital Technology, Katie Neves from Cool to Be Trans, as well as Jackie Gavin from British Volt. So without further ado, I will welcome the panelists to the stage.
Well, welcome to that. I know you've all had 2 days of events now, which is exciting. I think you spoke to one of our consultants, Fox, yesterday, and saw their film, which was really, really great. And I think Fox will come up maybe a couple of times in this conversation. But before we introduce everyone, I just want to introduce myself. So my name is Rich Miles. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a queer man, and I run a company called the Diversity Standards Collective. I used to be a creative director previously, which is a bit unusual for the D&I space. Normally, you stay being a creative because it's so much fun. But I went into the Diversity Standards Collective because I saw a lot of comms that was being created wasn't inclusive. I think if any of you here are from a community or whatever gender we are, we see things that just don't resonate and come across as tokenistic. So I set up the Diversity Standards Collective simply to connect agencies and brands to diverse people across the globe to help them make authentic and inclusive comms. Have any of you seen Christmas ads this year? I don't know if anyone's seen the Amazon ad that came out or the TK Maxx one. We worked with them. They worked with our consultants from the Black and South Asian community to help make sure that the characters in that were represented authentically. We also work with a lot of the trans community with IKEA and Crocs and stuff like that. So that's very exciting. Right, before we start, I've got a bit of audience participation, which everyone hates, which is great. And they're a bit of random questions, but you'll get where I'm going afterwards. So everyone see everyone up here as well. So watch everyone who raises their hand. So it's a raising hands question. So I wanted to know who here has seen the film Titanic? Everyone raise your hands if you've seen it. Haven't seen Titanic? Oh, God. No, that's right, you can put them down now. Who here has watched Squid Games? No, Ella. Who here would rather be on holiday right now in the sun? Yeah?
I can't possibly say yes.
You can't say yes. And who else? Who hates those, when you get those seeds in your teeth and no one tells you about it? Who hates those? Right. Everyone should raise their hands. The reason why I asked that is the next kind of question is, who here raised their hand at the same time as any of our panelists? I think probably all pretty much did if everyone watched Titanic. The reason I asked that is because when we're talking about inclusion in the workplace, one of the big things that happens is this idea of difference and that we've got nothing in common with people from different communities. And actually conversations seem to go flying out the window when we talk to different people, because we feel a bit like, oh, I don't know what to say, I don't know what I can say, what I can't say. But actually, just simple conversations like, hey, have you seen Squid Games? Isn't it good? Is like the first step in being inclusive and talking to people in a normal fashion. So that's sort of why I wanted to ask those questions up front. We're here, as I said today, to talk about trans inclusion in the workplace. Why is it important? It's important generally. I think everybody needs to make sure they feel included within the workplace. I don't think if you switch that around and said, who wants to be excluded in the workplace, nobody would answer that question. So it's important that whatever community we're from, we're including and we're understanding of the differences, but also understanding of our similarities. Next, I just want to introduce all of our panelists, or let them introduce themselves. I might pop it on you, Natalie, as you're here to introduce yourself first, please.
Hi everyone, Natalie Washington, pronouns are she, her, or they, them, equally happy with either. And I'm a trans woman from Surrey in the UK, and I work for Mars Digital Technologies. Basically, we had some debate about what my job title should be on here because it changes probably every 6 months, as probably anyone who works in tech knows. But basically, my team looks after kind of financial products internally to Mars, managing things like supply chain management, financial operations, controlling that kind of stuff. So I manage a global team basically that works in IT, let's put it that way. But yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell. I think we'll probably explore some topics later around, you know, transition in the workplace and so on and so forth. The other thing I would add, though, is that my other special interest is around LGBT inclusion in sports. So if anyone's interested in that, talk to me about that. I run a campaign called Football v Transphobia. So it's very much about creating a culture where LGBT people and trans people particularly can get into sports, can be included in sports and get the benefits from that.
Cool, thank you very much. And I'll pass you over to Katie.
Hi, Rich. And hello, everybody. So my name's Katie Neves. My pronouns are she and her. And I've been a photographer and filmmaker for the last 35 years. But 3.5 years ago, I came out very publicly, admitted to myself that I'm transgender after living for 48 years as a man and living with gender dysphoria for all my life, since my earliest memories, age around 3 or 4. And so I now have a new business called Cool to be Trans, where I do trans awareness training and inspirational speaking. And I'm on a mission to do 2 things. One is to reach out to other trans people to let them know that it is okay to be trans, because it really is okay to be trans. And so many trans people don't know that, especially at the start of their journey when they're in self-denial and they think the world's going to implode around them and that they won't be let in. Well, I'm here to tell them that the world will let them in. And the other thing is to reach out to everybody else and just to show, demystify the whole process and just show them that trans people are just ordinary people who want to be happy. And that's the entire message. And the other thing I'd like to point out, I noticed in the promotion graphic for this panel session that my promo pic, I'm wearing exactly the same outfit. I would like to point out, I do own more than one outfit.
Cool, thank you, Katie. And Ella.
Hi, I'm Ella Hall. I put Gabriella up there because that's my name on LinkedIn in case anyone wants to connect afterwards. I am currently working in education. I'm not quite sure how I got into education. It's kind of not where my heartland lies. I'm actually quite a commercial marketing director, and I have a history in media and advertising. Really, that's kind of my skill set. But I've also been very lucky to work with Rich at the DSC on lots of different briefs, and it's been really interesting to see how certainly go-getting, forward-thinking agencies are starting to look at how they can be more inclusive in their briefs. But it does also raise this perennial question of, I recently did some work for Rich and Danone, and my first thing was trans people don't eat yogurt differently. It's kind of around that concept of there is no difference except the difference that we create. But yes, my background is, and interestingly, I'm not always out. I very rarely tell anyone anything. In fact, I'm sure I'm probably outing myself today. And this is mainly because my experience of transit work isn't necessarily around, having any problem with it, but majorly that I just don't think it's relevant. It's just, to me, it's just not relevant to the fact that I'm very good at what I do for a living, and I always have been. And that's really where I want to get to, where it's, the coffee lunchroom conversation, water coolers, if we ever do that again, we may not, is not about, look at her over there. It's more around, all right, okay, whatever. So that's kind of my hopes for this. And it's really great to be asked today and to be with other professional trans women as well. So thank you for asking me.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Jackie.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, Jackie Gavin. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the global head of inclusion, culture and belonging with an organisation called British Volt. British Volt, if you pardon the pun, is leading the charge in vehicle electrification in terms of battery technology for the change that we're seeing, particularly in the automotive sector. But I suppose where I'm more famous, or some would argue where my more infamous moments come from, is where I was when I worked within the UK civil service, leading the change that was needed right across the Whitehall estate to make sure that trans inclusion was really, really a topic that was talked about right across the Whitehall estate. Obviously, I want to make sure that, like all my other panelists, we really, really turn and talk about this particular issue with the volume turned up. And I'll pause there and pass back to you, Rich.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for being here today. And I think it's really interesting because every one of you sort of has slightly different experiences and similar experiences, which again is something that everyone can relate to kind of in life, of having things in common and having things that aren't. And, the interesting thing about, generally being human is that we get to find all, those things out. We get to, discover interesting things about people, but also we get to sort of make friends in the workplace. And Ella mentioned that sort of the water cooler moment, which I think, has been in advertising in other places for a long time now. But, just having those really normal chats is super important. So that's basically what we're going to do today. So I'll fire around a different way, in a different direction. But first, I want to talk to everyone about their own lived experiences within the workplace. And I think it's kind of important that we hear actually maybe a negative experience that you've all had, but also a positive one. And then we'll go around and talk about like solutions and how as allies or as other trans people, we can support each other in the workplace. So I'm going to look at Katie first. Do you want to tell us about like an experience you've had in the workplace?
Yeah, well, I think, I suppose mine was different to I think most of the others though, in that I'm self-employed and I've been self-employed for a long time. And so I was running my own business. I'd been running my own business for 22 years when I came out very publicly. And the thing is that the name of the business was and still is named after my old male name, which is Martin. It's Martin Neves Photography and Film. And it had been an established brand for 22 years, and I was and still am actually ranked second in the UK on Free Index for customer reviews and everything. So I just felt that at that stage the brand was too strong, and so I couldn't change the name to Katie Neves Photography and Film when I came out. So I had to come out very honestly and very openly and very publicly as being trans. So what I decided to do was to make a coming out video, and I sent it to all my clients and I put it on all my social media, go big or go home. And I remember now my finger nervously hovering over the mouse, knowing that as soon as I make that click to make the video live, my life would never be the same again. Anyway, I clicked the mouse and I waited, but then I had to go out on a job. My mind wasn't on the job. But anyway, I was so worried what was going to be going on. Anyway, I couldn't wait to get back to see what was happening on Facebook. It was the first one. When I got back, I was so delighted. I was inundated with hundreds of messages of support. I was so surprised. I was so frightened, because the thing is that if my clients, because I didn't have any long-term clients, if my clients had an issue with me, then the phone would stop ringing and I'd lose all my income. And so I was so worried about losing my livelihood, my reputation, everything. But I was so pleasantly surprised that the vast majority of people were supportive. I did lose some clients through it, and some that I was surprised about, some that I didn't think that I'd lose. But then others I kept that I thought I would lose. So I think it was a balanced thing, but overall it was a really, really positive thing in coming out.
Brilliant. And like, obviously from your angle, you're self-employed, you're your own business. So you reach out and speak to clients all the time, from the entire business's point of view. What are those little things that maybe happen when you connect with those clients that maybe you can see them positively reinforcing or being inclusive of you?
I think just accepting it. I mean, I remember the first time I went on a job in a dress. I was so frightened. I was thinking, how are people going to react? But it was just brilliant. So from day one, they were absolutely phenomenal. I just haven't had any problems there. They've just been so supportive. They just treated me as a professional photographer that I am, and that's the most important thing. And that's it. And they've used the correct pronouns and everything. They've been phenomenal. And the thing is, I cut people a lot of slack in that to begin with. I knew that it was going to be tricky for a lot of people to start using Katie instead of Martin, and start using she and her instead of he and him, because it's difficult, because everybody's on a journey with this. And so I think you need to cut them a bit of slack both ways, but they were brilliant. They were absolutely phenomenal. Brilliant.
And actually pronouns is really important to kind of talk about, because people, allies are, worried about accidentally misgendering people. And, let's say there's maybe some leeway in that, as you say, in the first instance. What's your take on if somebody misgenders you, and what should an ally do if they do that? Okay, I think the first thing is how it's done. So if it's done deliberately, that's a different thing to if it's just been slipped up. Because as gender non-conforming people, we know the people who are supportive and the people who are not supportive. And if the people who are supportive just slip up from time to time and call me he, him, or Martin, because they've known me for donkey's years as that, then it doesn't bother me, because I know it's just a slip of the tongue and they are supportive. But if somebody does it continuously and deliberately, then that shouldn't be put up with. And it's I liken it to being jabbed with a knitting needle. Once or twice isn't going to hurt, because it's just a knitting needle. But if you're jabbed over and over and over again with a knitting needle, it really gets to you and it really hurts. So what I would say to
allies that do slip up from time to time, don't beat yourself up about it. You probably will, but try not to. But just apologize and move on. Don't make a big deal out of it. Just apologize, move on, and then the trans person knows that that you've apologized, and that's it. That's the end of it. Yeah.
And final question actually is on that. I get asked this a lot at work actually. Is should I send a note? Should I send an email to the person who just really apologized for misgendering them? You mentioned just then about sort of apologizing, move on, and not making a big deal. Do you think allies, if it's done accidentally in the sort of terms that you're talking about, need to send like an email or a letter of apology?
They don't need to. I suppose it's nice to receive that sort of thing because it shows that they how deeply they're apologising for it. But it's not. For me, it's not particularly necessary. I think if they apologise at the time, that's fine for me. But others may feel differently about it.
Yeah, no, again, the reason why I ask this is because it gets asked a lot, and a lot of our consultants will say, no, you don't need to send a whole letter of apology because for the trans person, you may get 8 or 9 of those a day, which actually doesn't need to be actually, if you can, do it and move on and make sure you don't do it again. It's as simple as that. So thank you, Katie.
No problem.
Natalie, what about you? Do you want to share a sort of an experience at the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I actually came out as trans in the place I currently work, same office, and that was 2013, 14, kind of spread across a little bit of time, getting, anyone who's ever come out as anything, frankly, but particularly trans, it takes forever to come out to all these people. So, and actually, it's a triumph in kind of good management, inclusive leadership that I came out in the first place, because I kind of came out in the workplace a little bit by accident, because I had a manager at the time who was a great coach and was doing the 5 whys and was doing all these kind of why. I was having a bit of a struggle at the time. And eventually I was just like, I'm just going to tell him, I'm just going to come out with it. And I hadn't even decided to transition at the time. This was beforehand when I was still a little bit working my own identity out. And so he kind of coaxed it out of me. But part of that was, of course, he'd created that situation in which it was safe to share things. And he'd done some of that by sharing some stuff of his own, but maybe we come back to that later. But sort of the experience of actually coming out itself was, I'm pleased to say, really, really good. I had lots of people around me. I was quite tactical about how I did it, did a bit of stakeholder management, got some allies on side first. But went really well. I work in an office where there's sort of 160 people. It's a big open plan. Mars is one of these companies where we like to have, nobody has their own office. And so stuff gets around fast and everybody sees you. So on that first day, when you come out, you've maybe made some changes to your appearance to try and kind of hint at the gender that you want to be perceived as. People tend to notice. But it was, really, really very good. It was big news around the business. So I sent an email. Well, I was quite tactical about it. So I composed an email, and I worked from home that day. Composed an email, gave it to my boss, who obviously already knew, and said, "Look, can you send this out? Send it out sometime in the afternoon. Let me know when you're going to do it, and I'm going to log off 10 minutes beforehand. I'm going to log off for 3 days and see what happens." I took a couple of days off, and he did that, and it went around the whole office, and it went around a load of stakeholders I had, and people who I work with in Russia, Brazil, the US, China, lots of places. And that got forwarded, and it got forwarded again, and it got forwarded again, and it ended up being seen by thousands of people. So there was no hiding. But I got loads of emails back, and I actually kept a lot of those emails in a folder, for the darker, harder moments when I was struggling with. There was all these people supporting me, which was really wonderful from all areas of the business, very, very senior people down to people, frankly, I'd never even encountered in my work, But I think what's important is a lot of people think that supporting somebody in the workplace through that experience, that coming out, that disclosing your identity to people, and obviously it works in different ways depending what it is. Once they're through that, there's the end of it, but it's not. There's a whole lot going on after that, transitioning in the UK on the NHS takes a long time. So there was lots of stuff I was going through, lots of challenges in accessing healthcare. This was 8 years ago when it was probably in a less bad state than it is now. Lots of challenges through that, lots of mental challenges, lots of really difficult times where I was struggling with, relationships that had broken down or other things that were going on in my life that I thought, were impacting on my ability to bring my whole self to the workplace, And, I won't say that there weren't times that were a little bit difficult that my workplace could have done better. I work in IT, right? I understand the system issues, but it took a long time to kind of get my name changed on everything, so I didn't have to keep explaining to people. Old pictures would pop up every now and again. Even now, sometimes, you know, in some old HR systems, I get issues, but we're a complicated organisation, so that happens a lot. But also, I think, you know, it's things tangentially related to the workplace as well. So we were going through a reorganisation at one point. And I was thinking, right, I need to look what opportunities are out there in the labour market, because, you know, I might not have a role when this finishes. And the experience I had looking for a job in sort of 2016 was vastly different to any experience I'd had looking for a job before. Places where I'm confident I would have strolled into an interview before. I didn't get an interview. Interviews where I thought, yeah, I've done really well here. You know, I'm absolutely qualified for this job. Didn't get a call back. Those were interesting experiences that I wasn't used to, having gone through life previously being perceived as a white man here who is you know, perceived to be straight and, you know, in the most privileged echelons, if you will. So that was I guess a wake up. That was interesting. But I think in the main, you know, I would say I've had lots of positive experiences. There's lots of aspects where being trans has been a limit to my career in some ways, whether that's through hard structures, you know, like, you know, not being able to get a job, or just things like being perceived as someone. I remember I had a conversation with my boss once around global mobility in terms of next role, and, you know, can you go and travel somewhere else? And there was a perception around the organisation that I didn't want to be globally mobile. I wouldn't go and take a job in another country. I had to keep reiterating that it's not that. It's just that there are some countries I don't feel welcomed, you know, and that's obviously a complicated picture as well. But I think I have personally got a lot out of being open with my identity, and personally got a lot out of kind of being able to be my whole self and understand my whole self. And I always like to say, as trans people, we get an opportunity to do a lot of self-reflection and to do a lot of analysis of what it is that makes us us, that other people maybe don't get triggered to do, if you will. But, you know, challenges as well.
Yeah. No, but I mean, you mentioned a lot of sort of experiences in the journey there. And one of the things you mentioned early on was about creating that sort of safe space to have those conversations in companies. And I know that if maybe somebody is transitioning in the company, or to be honest, safe spaces are important for all, you know, all different communities as well. Do you have any advice on how a company can set up or create that safe space, and what a safe space really means?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think it's very cultural. And there's some businesses, I guess, will have there are a lot of businesses that like to think they have a very inclusive culture automatically, but of course that's only as good as the people in the business and what they do. And I think it's incumbent upon anyone who is a leader, and that doesn't mean you have to have people reporting into you. We all lead in different ways. It's incumbent upon anyone to have attitudes of curiosity, to have attitudes of listening, to have attitudes of trying to make sure that the right voice is heard. There were some great conversations in the panel before lunch about how you make sure that the right voice is heard in the room. I think that culture of listening and that culture of curiosity and that culture of thinking, who isn't being heard on this? How is my behavior, how is our organizational behavior impacting on individuals? Really, really important, and everybody can do it. Everyone who's leading people, everyone who's sitting in a meeting, everyone who's devising strategy can all think about these things. How can I make this a place that makes everyone feel that they're valuable?
Yeah. And listening is a really key point. I think being an ally and in a safe space, I think a lot of people think that they need to have the answers and need to be able to give a suggestion to be included in somebody else's experience. But actually, the most important thing is to listen to someone's experience, empathize with it, and help them, or, you know, work with them to, you know, whatever guise the situation say it is. But listening is key, right?
Yeah, and the power actually is often in getting it wrong.
Yeah.
Because, you know, like Katie's just said around pronouns, sometimes we learn that we're using the wrong pronouns by getting it wrong and being corrected, right? So it's how you deal with that feedback loop of, oh, I've made a misstep. Yeah. This is how I'll resolve the situation, and this is how I'll move ahead. Yeah. And if you don't try, you won't make a mistake and you won't learn. No. So I think it's in leadership of any sort, it's always around how can I make it safe to make mistakes and make it safe to correct mistakes.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because in sort of like any career, even in, like, you know, when we're in school, we're told that we will make mistakes, but making mistakes helps us learn and helps us improve. If we start a new job, they're like, don't worry if you get it wrong the first couple of weeks, we'll do this. But in the sort of D&I space, there's that conversation is gone, because I mean, we know why it's important to not make mistakes, because there's people, there's emotion, there's communities involved. But I think if we can create those safe spaces where we can understand what's wrong rather than trying to hide it, then we can learn and move on much quicker. Mistakes are made normally because we pretend we know everything and we try and be as exclusive as possible, but we haven't done the pre-work. So that's why that's really important. Jackie, I'll go to you next. Do you want to share with us an experience that you've kind of had at work or within the workplace?
So thanks, Richard. I mean, for me, I went through gender transition 36 years ago for my sins, and the world was very, very different then, but very much the same as where we are today, sadly. But my experience, certainly when I worked for post office counters, or plain and simply the post office as it is these days, was very, very positive. We wrote one of the very first gender or transition process as a policy, first ones in the UK, if not the world, to be able to provide that level of support. So I was very, very privileged to be working for that organisation at that time. 6 years later, as I decided to move my career on to elsewhere, began what I describe as my patchwork quilt era of jobs, because after that, it felt like I was having to explain myself again and again and again, and I was going from job to job to job. I just couldn't find myself settling in, because no matter what I did, it got to the point where I was just having to explain again and again. It wasn't until probably about 2004, I reckon, when I had to go through and get we had the Gender Recognition Act around that time. And of course, I was able to get my GRC, Gender Recognition Certificate. I must be aware of pronouns and acronyms, sorry. So very much in that kind of space, it was very much a case of, you know what, now I'm able to get into a place where I feel I'm now being able to do it. And surprisingly, most of all, where I got that huge amount of support was when I joined the UK Civil Service, as I explained before. They were very much instrumental in giving me a platform to be able to use my lived experience, but also use my experience as an activist out there in the world, trying to change the world and make it a better place. And they really, really got it and really wanted to make this a really important part of the agenda. So, as I say, a mixture of both positive and negative, but I think it's something that you deal with, and you have to deal with it appropriately and not hold on to it as a negative. We have to go back to the point where we drive ourselves forward.
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, one way of supporting, as you're saying, and I think probably all of us here, because we're all doing a talk, is that, you know, giving people space and giving people the time to talk about their lived experience is really important. We know that, you know, there's obviously many trans people within the UK and the world who maybe, you know, don't necessarily want that space or don't want to talk about their transition. Have you got any advice for businesses who just want to support their staff in that way?
I think it's just about giving the right level of support. I mean, I talk about heading up inclusion with an organisation, and I think if you embed a culture that allows people to be their authentic self, that is probably one of the most important things that any organisation can be able to do in that space. And for the individual themselves, I think it's equally as important to realize that, yes, whilst if you are going through the gender transition process, it's a deeply personal process, but you're not the only one that's going through that process as well. Everybody else that's connected to you will go through that adjustment, and they have to find a way to make that adjustment. And picking back on the point on what Katie was saying as well, that people will make mistakes, and that's okay as long as it's done in the right way, and we are actually making sure that, I mean, Katie talks about knitting needles, I more say ow, and I think that's the important point, just to remind people that if you do go too far, it can be hurtful.
Yeah, and I think, you know, people who haven't had the transgender sort of experience, I think we can all relate to what happens if we are misgendered. You know, it's not something that we would take more than once or twice from somebody without correcting them or without getting annoyed. So I think that is you know, a universal understanding for that fact. Thanks, Jackie. Ella, hi. First, thank you for mentioning your DSC. I'll pay you later. Otherwise, do you want to share with us your an experience that you've had within the workplace?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's really interesting to hear because I don't talk to people about this stuff, so it's really great to hear everyone else's stories, and it's a lot of bravery. I wasn't so brave, and I'll say now that I have a different route. which I think is just as, just as reasonable, but it's just a different route. And I was working at the Sun and News of the World when I decided to transition. There's absolutely no way in God's green earth I was going to do anything in that kind of environment. It was a terrible place. Luckily, all of my bosses were fired and put in prison, and I ended up leaving. So I then sort of, I had access to money. I was lucky. I did it privately, and I went away and came back differently. I did. That's how I did it. I try not to feel like that's a sellout, given that, my illustrious company of people who've actually sat in trenches with transition. But I'll say this, 51% of people are still in stealth. It's called stealth, if you're not familiar with that word, at work, which means they don't present. Now, I transitioned to fit my body to my mind. I thought I was a little girl until I was 5, and then someone told me I wasn't. So, no, you're not. So I needed to get that sorted. And once I'd done that, to me, that was it. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want any conversation about it. I was a very good marketing person. Well, I thought I was. I don't know if I was. I was a good marketing person before, and I think I'm quite a good marketing person. And to me, as I've always maintained with my teams at work, it doesn't matter, how you turn up. If you can do your job, brilliant. So I had a different experience where I didn't out myself, but I was outed. I worked for a company that was quite closely associated with the National Lottery, and someone outed me there. An ex-boyfriend actually outed me because he was not a very happy man, and it shafted my career with them. They went from, it was an interesting thing. It went from the HR woman who was like, in my experience, and I'll say this not to offend any HR people, but totally untrustworthy. So she told, I don't know, all and sundry. And I can remember that the day before, this guy had come into my office and said, "Oh, do you want to come for lunch?" And I was like, oh, okay. And that was off. Everything was cancelled. And suddenly I was fired for some other reason. It was in the beginning of the contract. This is 15 years ago. So that happened. And I remember just suddenly, it was like as though I'd been really green. So I'd just woken up to the reality of the world, in that a lot of people, and this is still fact now, do not like the trans issue because it scares them, it frightens them, and it just, I don't want to go near it. So yeah. And I was very, very kind of in with the States in that company. They'd wanted me to go out. All of those invitations were rescinded, and a week later I was let go. And I used to say it was because of the fact they'd found out, and I still maintain it. I mean, it just, there was no coincidence. Nothing else had happened. That's happened to me twice. I worked later for a place in Manchester where there was a fintech company, and they did a credit search on me. And for some reason, I have absolutely no idea why, there was a notice of correction on my credit search with my former name. And the HR woman phoned me, and I went up to ask, and she said, I just want to let you know that we did your credit search. And I thought, well, did it come back badly? Because I have historically had a terrible credit record. And they said, no, but there was this thing. And I said, well, what thing was that? And she told me, and all I can remember by that time, I said, and what has that got to do with my ability to do my job? And she's, and I could see her just milling that thing of, like just a traditional woman in HR who was just a gossip, and she told the HR team, and so for me, the safe thing is keep your mouth shut. It's nobody's business. If they don't want anyone to know, it's got absolutely nothing to do with the people that you're working with. And if it hasn't got if it hasn't got any impact on your job, then what's it got to do with anyone else? So sorry if I sound a bit passionate about that, but when I think back to those things, if somebody came to me and said, I like bell ringing on Wednesdays and I didn't like campanologists, that would have nothing to do with their ability to do a job. So I think for me, my experience has been that. However, I recently did some work for a German personal wellness company, and I told them, because actually the industry was sex toys, really. And they were great. They said, oh, it's great, different perspective. That would be really interesting. So where it's useful for my career, I've been out about it. But in general, and even now, if there was someone in the room there, I can't see anyone there, but if there was someone in the room there who said, oh, I didn't know that, I would expect that just to be a sort of, okay, because to me, I mean, I've retained a sense of privacy in all of my life. I just don't think I have to talk about things. And to be taken as who I am, the woman who I am at work, means I don't need to explain my history or who I've chosen to go to bed with or what surgery I've had or any of those things. However, the reason I do things like this is because if someone is considering it, I'm happy to help, support and mentor through those things, because it's a very difficult time. And I think possibly, you know, I had a lot more chutzpah when I was in my 20s and 30s than I do now, and I find it quite difficult. I also became aware of a phenomenon called TERFs, which I was completely and utterly oblivious to about 2 years ago. And that really scared me to see that there was such sort of menacing hatred towards trans women. That really upset me. So I also think if you find any of that going on in the workplace, you have to have a place to go to, an HR person who you can trust. And those people need to be trained to, I mean, maybe I just had 2 bad experiences, but 2 out of, you know, 2 companies, that seems like quite a lot. Yeah, so that's my negative experience. But in general, you know, I have a very good work life.
No, good. And one of the things you mentioned is, what you've talked about is this sort of discovery. And I think we see it in offices today, of this sort of this morbid curiosity of wanting to find out, and then, you know, and then being, you know, we get the things that people are saying like, oh, I never knew, or you don't look trans, or, you know, just as a gay guy, you get, oh, you didn't realize you were gay, you know, all those things. You don't look gay, you don't sound gay, all those things. How do you feel about this sort of curiosity? And you mentioned about flipping it to okay, and it just being a moving on thing. What would you advise people who see that happen in the workplace, people trying to find out or passing it around and gossiping about that sort of thing?
Be professional. You know, it is hard to be professional at work. I mean, I worked in advertising, as you know. It was probably until a few years ago. I mean, it was a place where people were drunk at their desks on a Friday. It was great fun, but it wasn't professional in the sense that a lot of the people who are in your audience who will be from banking, for example, you know, I mean, it was gossipy and affairy and all that stuff. And you know, that's why I did it to start off with. But I think from a sort of stopping that stuff, you know, I've had people come to me at work and tell me things about their lives that stop here because I'm a professional, but also it's not anyone else's business. I think on the other side of that, though, you have to kind of accept that this is what I keep thinking about with sort of trans inclusion or any inclusion, anything really, about where you're taking up people's time with a difference, right? Is most people in the workplace are just there to do their job, go home, pick up their kids from school, you know, feed the whatever cat, dog. And in a way, you have to be sort of careful of how much you ask of them, because at some point, if you say, well, you have to accept this, you have to, you know, you're kind of almost pushing an agenda, which they're going to say, oh, I'm not doing that. So I think from my point of view, the onus is on me to be as professional as I can. So after that happened with that odious HR woman at that company in Manchester, I went back to my desk and got on with my job. You know, I didn't do anything. And she called me and said, no, do you want to talk about it? And I said, there's nothing to talk about, other than that you probably need not to talk so much about things with people that it doesn't concern. So I think how the advice I would give is don't for the sake of a cheap thrill of passing on some cheap gossip, the impact of that could be very serious for somebody. You know, National Trans Remembrance Day is about somebody, a woman, Rita Hester, who was murdered. You know, this is what happens. There is a lot of, you know, and I hate to bring this to a business context, but there's a lot of kind of eroticized rage around trans women, and it can be very, very dangerous if in the wrong hands. So if someone's choosing not to tell, then there's probably a reason for that. You know?
Yeah, and do you know what? I'm noticing time, so you passed me a stat yesterday, Ella, which I'm going to read out, which actually moves straight on from what you've just said here. And the fact is, that's written fact, stat, 55% of the LGBTQ community, the hate crimes towards them are towards trans women. So half of our community hate crimes are towards trans women, and they only make up 4% of our community. And 50% of those women are women of color, trans women are women of color. So it's a huge stat to think of. Over half of the violence towards the LGBT community as a whole is just aimed at the 4% of trans people, which is why, as exactly as you said, it's super important that we start from the ground up and include people on that everyday level. And before we move on to Katie to talk about Transgender Day of Remembrance, I just wanted to ask you one quick question, which is, Any company here and you're thinking about being inclusive for the transgender community, or any other communities, obviously there is a whole host of things, and actually there's a large number of stuff that you can do to be more inclusive in your contracts, in your work structure, in your culture, etc., etc. But that sort of everyday, like what can you all leave the room now and do tomorrow to be more inclusive? I just wanted to ask that of each of you. And Ella, I don't know if you want to go first. What would you advise somebody sat in this room is the one thing that they can do to be more inclusive to even someone like yourself?
Just be kind. Just be kind. Think of your brother, your sister, your mother, your friend, and if it helps to not think of it as a trans issue, think of it as a person issue. Somebody had a problem with any other area of their life that could potentially be a weakness to them if other people were included, just and also don't ask them really weird questions once you know. That's strange questions which have got nothing to do, with business.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And Jackie, what about you? What was your kind of everyday action that people can take?
I think it's exactly as Ella said, is just be kind and recognize it and not make something of it, just acknowledge it and move on and just get into that normalizing the conversation, if I can put it in that kind of context.
And Katie, what about you?
Yeah, I think, again, I think Ella hit the nail on the head there about being kind, but I would say also other things like just showing your support, like just in using your displaying your pronouns on your email signatures and on your social media, because it shows that it's, pronouns are for everyone. They're not just for trans people, because many people have names that are non-gender specific anyway. So it's just good practice to do that sort of thing, and also just to encourage your HR managers and training managers to have mandatory trans awareness training, because if they're serious about changing the culture, then everyone needs to be trained in it. It's not just, it's no use just having a lunch and learn session once a year when people who want to come along, come along, because then the people that come along are the ones that are already on side, and the people that really need that education don't turn up. So I think it needs to be mandatory. So I think those are the top tips, I think.
Great, thanks. And Natalie?
Yeah, so for me, I would say, to say something different, be prepared to take stands, and sometimes be prepared to take unpopular stands. So make sure that you've got parental leave policies that include trans men and non-binary people. Make sure that your work around including more women-owned businesses in your supply chain includes trans women. And sometimes you'll get noise for these things. There's a whole lobby out there that will attack you for saying that trans men can be pregnant. But be prepared to take some of these unpopular stands and stand by them, because trans people will recognize that and they'll see that this is an organization, or this is the company that cares about being inclusive of trans people, and you'll get the benefit of that talent.
Yeah, no, amazing. And, just to go back to the task we did at the beginning, where everyone put their hands up, it sounds really stupid, but going up to somebody and just being like, hey, have you seen Squid Games? And making somebody feel included or talked to is actually the real base level thing that we should be doing to everybody. If somebody's walked into that room and they may feel, that everybody's sort of watching them or thinking of or talking about them, or there's all this pressure, just having that release of somebody just being like, are you all right? Or, talking about something really normal can actually make a massive, massive difference from the bottom level. So I definitely advise doing that. I'm just going to pass you over to Katie now, just to give us a bit of a talk about Trans Day of Remembrance.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Well, today is Transgender Day of Remembrance, and the stats are horrific, to be honest. So 375 trans and gender diverse people have been reported murdered in the last year. And that number is just growing year on year. So if you go back 10 years, the number is almost double than it was 10 years ago. So it's horrendous. It's not going in the right direction at all. And 96% of those killed globally were trans women or femmes. And the average age of those killed was 30 years old. And the youngest was just 13 years old. 89% of those people in the USA were killed were people of colour, and 43% of those killed in Europe were migrants. And all of these figures, none of these figures even represent any of the people who've decided to take their own lives because they felt that that was the better option than to live in a society that wouldn't accept them. So scary stats, but it just shows why we need more trans awareness and more acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's astonishing. And do you know what? it takes so much effort to hate people. And you know, you never get it really. It's so easy just to like people, but to hate them takes, you have to have hate, you have to talk about it all the time. You have to do this. It just feels ridiculous. So that's my thought on it. It's easy to be nice and to smile at people and to support and to make sure those things don't happen. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I know this is the time when I ask if anyone wants questions and nobody puts their hands up, but you know, this is you know, a good time, to a safe space to ask anyone here any sort of questions you may have, or something going on at work you want some advice on, or you just want to ask people about their experience. You know, does anyone have any questions for our panelists at all?
Hi there. Thanks so much for the frank discussion. It was really interesting. I think my question is probably most to Natalie and Jackie. I think coming out in the workplace, one of the big things that is sort of helped that process is how managers react, leadership reacts, and how they sort of can prepare the rest of the teams. Do you two or anyone else have any examples of things where things went well or not necessarily as well, despite best intentions, so the rest of us could sort of learn from it as potential upcoming leaders in our respective fields?
Yeah, yeah, great question. I think, I mean, I touched on a couple of bits. One thing that worked really well for me was I was like, coming out in a workplace for me was pretty scary. You know, I was worried about what people were going to say. So having the support of my manager and my manager's manager and so on, and having them send some of the communications for me to some of the stakeholders kind of set the tone that I have their support. So I think for managers to be able to do that, if the person who is, you know, disclosing their identity at that point wants them to do that, obviously I wouldn't say the manager should say, no, you don't talk about it, I'll talk about it, because you don't want to kind of steal narrative. But I think showing that sort of support is important. And I think other things would be doing something even when you don't think there's someone there who you need to do that display for. You know, can you recognize days like Trans Awareness Week or something like that? Or can you do something in your team meetings or whatever to show that, for example, introduce pronouns or something when there's someone new in the team? You don't know that that person's not trans, so maybe just give them the opportunity. So just something that says that this is a safe place, because you never know who might be in your team and who is in your workplace that's thinking about coming out. And that one little moment of inclusion, that one little show of some sort of awareness can be the thing that makes that person go, ah, this is somewhere that's safe for me to be out. And of course, then you might get, you know, a really engaged and sort of dedicated employee for a bit longer. So that's probably the most obvious one.
Cool. And Jackie, do you have anything else to add to that?
I think the best thing I can advise is to be led by the individual, let the individual dictate the terms, what they feel is best for them, because every single individual, there's not a one size fits all for all trans people. As much as we like to write policies and processes and stuff like that, it's more important to be led by the individual, because the individual will tell you how they feel, if they want to be able to do it invisibly, if they want to do it in a way that is out and loud and proud, however the individual wants to do it, because nobody, as I say, is exactly the same. Let the individual tell you what they want from their side.
I think that's a really good point, actually, which is, and a lot of businesses try and do it, isn't it? They try to have all the answers when actually it is individual led, and it is different for all of you here as well today about how maybe you would have approached it in work. So, you know, great. Thank you very much. Does anyone else have another question? We've got a minute or two left. No?
Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Please don't be shy.
Do any of you have a question for each other at all? I know some of you maybe met for the first time or the second time. Does anyone have a question? Panelist.
Mm-hmm. Never had that one before, Rich.
You've put that on, put us on the spot, haven't you?
Someone ask a question. No, I mean, the clock has gone 2:30, so everyone's lucked out there. But I just want to thank all of you for sitting and listening. You know, that's the first thing that I think Natalie talked about. It was about, you know, being a good ally is about listening and understanding. So thank you very much. And thanks also to Ella, Jackie, Katie, and Natalie for sharing your professional experience, your lived experience, and just being really open and honest to everybody and enabling us to have this safe space to have this conversation. So thank you very much, everybody.
for facilitating such an insightful panel and taking time to join us at EUROUT today. We really appreciate it. Let's give it up one more time for our panel.
Thank you.